We began yesterday the Mishnah on Kuf Tes Zayin, and we turned to Amid Beis. And we talked about Rabbi Gamliel's statement, Kol Shelo Omar Shlosha Dvarim Elu B'Pesach Lo Yotza Yidei Chovasa V'Elein Pesach Matzu Mor. And we began this gigantic note number Aleph, in which he approaches Rabbi Gamliel from two possible different perspectives. And we're not sure what Lo Yotzi Yidei Chovaso means. According to one interpretation, and he has a list of Rishonim, Lo Yotza Chovas Mitzvahs Achilas Pesach Matzu Mor. In other words, the mitzvah is not just the Maisa Achila. You know, I've got the matzah, I got the Pesach Mor. No. You have to first discuss the reasoning and the tamim of the mitzvah, each one respectively, and then eat the matzah more. If you didn't, and you just ate it like a piece of matzah, you know, like a cracker, as I said yesterday, then you're not yotzei. And the second approach was, and this he attributes to the Rash Beitz, is that he hasn't fulfilled his mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. So Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim doesn't mean just simply telling the story of the Makkos and the Shibud and the Geula. It also means that we have to verbally define and speak about the mitzvahs halayla and connect the mitzvahs halayla to Yitzias Mitzrayim, which we'll see in the rest of the Mishnah. He writes here, we're up to line, I think we got up to line 9 over here. Uliderech hasovrim shudin b'mitzvahs Pesach matzah umarar. If we go according to the first approach, and that is Pesach matzah umarar, which we said was the approach of the Orchos Chaim and many other Rishonim, then he says, Mashenosaf bahem chiyuv hamira, the additional chiyuv hamira, mishum shematzanu shehikved hakosiv ba'amira of Haggadah. The Torah wants and requires of us to verbally speak, and that's Haggadah, Amira. And now we're taking that requirement of Haggadah and Amira, and we're introducing it into the very fabric of the mitzvah of Achilas Matzah, etc. And now he quotes the Tosfos that derives it from the pasuk V'amartem Zevach Pesach hu Hashem Asher Posach. And the words Pesach Zeh are sort of like an introduction or an addendum to the Achilas HaPesach. And Pesach Zeh means V'amartem. It's not enough to eat the Pesach, but you have to speak about the Korban Pesach, Asher Posach Hashem, that God skipped over the Batei Avoseinu Mitzrayim. Mikan sheyesh chiyuv lomar Pesach zeh, and we find the same thing in Matzu Mor, either because bavur zeh or for the Hekesh we always equate Matzu Mor to Pesach. And not only that, we have to add what we saw in Kuf Tes Vav about the words lechem oni, which the Mishnah interprets as referring to lechem sha'onim olav dvarim harbe. Let's quickly go back to Kuf Tes Vav. He says on Kuf Tes Vav Amid Beis, Amar Shmuel. So that's 4 lines up before the end of Kuf Tes Vav Amid Beis. Lechem oni, lechem sha'onim olav dvarim, and you speak about the lechem. So that requires an amira and haggadah over the lechem. And that's the definition of matzah. Matzah is lechem oni. So the mitzvah of eating matzah means eat lechem oni. And what does it mean to eat lechem oni? Eat lechem sha'onim olav dvarim harbe. That you spoke about the meaning of the matzah. He says, in the name of the Aruch LaNer, this we we should underline that Amira Zu, this Amira of Ram Gamliel that we're about to learn, he chelek mi mitzvahs Pesach Matzumor, Minat Torah. And it's not a rabbinic requirement. This is a doraisa. Right? Tosas derives from the pasuk Pesach Zeh, or if we derive it from Shmuel's Lechem Oni, Shodem Olav Dvarim Harbi. This is a doraisa requirement that the Amira is an integral, essential part of the mitzvah of Matzah Umar Minat Torah. Bilule Amira, if he omits the Amira of Pesach Zeh, Al Shuma, etc., Lo Yotzi de Chovaso b'mitzvos elu, but now he adds Af b'di'evet. Now here, at this point, Yovo Baldin v'Yachlok, there's room for analysis and a possible rejection. It's not true to say Lo Yotzi de Chovas mitzvos elu afilu b'di'evet. But rather, we should apply here more of like a brisker tzvei dinim kind of thing. That there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of matzah, etc. There's one dimension of the achila itself, and another dimension of the amira. So if you omit the amira, that's one dimension of the matzah that you don't fulfill, but I would still say that as far as the definition of matzah as a maisa achila, that you fulfill even without the amira. Ulam aran varitva kosvu she'ena kavanah shelo yotza yedei chova klal. Right? It's not like you didn't fulfill anything. El shelo kiyem mitzvah karoi. So again, the word karoi means in the proper way, the ideal way, which means the additional kiyum of Pesach Zeh. You know, one thought that crosses my mind, and maybe I should reject it immediately, is that let's say you ate the matzah without the amira. So now you have to eat another kizayis matzah with the amira. Okay, fine. But the second kizayis, for the sake of amira, does it have to be matzah's mitzvah, meaning that it was baked l'shem mitzvah, or maybe any matzah will do? I don't know. And also, it occurs to me that we should take a look at the Harei Kedem. You have the Harei Kedem, am I right? Ela shelo kiyem ha-mitzvah karoi, v'cheinu b'Ramban, sheb'di'evet yotza. And again, I would say that b'di'evet yotza means he fulfills one dimension out of two. Okay, now we're going back to the Rashbeitz. Nisbayer ba'orach laner shalamedim zos mimashenemar b'Torah b'mitzvah sipri tzis Mitzrayim v'gadet lebincha bavur zeh. So the bavur zeh, pointing to the matzah, is part of the mitzvah v'gadet lebincha. And what does it mean to point to the matzah? Bavur zeh means to explain what the matzah is all about. Bir bavur zeh, bavur pesach matzu mor amunochim lefanecha, umikan shezeu ikar mitzvahs hagod. See, I'm thinking out loud here that the word ba'avur, right? He says, ubir ba'avur zeh ba'avur Pesach Matzumor. The word ba'avur might have a deeper meaning here in this context. Maybe it means that God took us out of Mitzrayim for the sake of these mitzvahs, for the purpose of our fulfilling these mitzvahs. I mean, that's not what Rabbi Gamliel says, but I'm just saying in the way he formulates it here, in the name of the Aruch LaNer. Ubir Od, furthermore, Shehu Shiur b'mitzvahs Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Klomar, Af Shalamala, as far as how far you could go on the other end, not the minimum, but the maximum, ain't Shir LeMitzvah. There's no ceiling, there's no maximum. You can keep going and going and going. There's a minimum, an absolute minimum requirement in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, for who, Shalachal HaPachas, at the very minimum, Yomar Hatam HaMafurash Bapsukim LeMitzvahs Elu, to explain the reasoning behind these mitzvahs. The Pachas Miseh, and if you omit the basic bottom line requirement of explaining the Tamei HaMitzvahs, is Eino Yotzi Dei Chova Afilu B'Diavad. He has not fulfilled his mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Here I would say the Afilu B'Diavad should be taken at face value. There's no other dimension that he has fulfilled, B'Diavad. There's nothing, because this is so critical to Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. We got it to Bincha before it said that without it, you forfeit the mitzvah. The Od Nilmad Midivrei Rav Gamliel Sha'af Shesiper Kol Halayla Miyetzias Mitzrayim Elo Shelo Pirish Tam Malolo Yotzi Leichavos. So for hours and hours, he's telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, but he missed one point, which is absolutely indispensable, and that is to describe the Tamei HaMitzvahs. Okay, so now I want to take out the Harei Kedem. Oops. So let's see page Kuf Ayin Aleph. Kosav Rambam, this is the bottom left. Perches Milchus Chometz Batzalach Daled Umachzer Hashulchan Lefonov V'Omer Pesach Zeh Umagbia Hamor Biyodo the Omer Morzeh, Makbia Hamatzah B'Yodav Omer Matzah Zu. And he quotes the Gemara, which we haven't gotten to yet, that Omar Rava Matzah Tzorch Lakbia, Mor Tzorch Lakbia, Basar Ein Tzorch Lakbia. So the Rambam does not say that he lifts up the Korban Pesach. And the Gemara says, because Nira Ke'ochel Kodshim Bachutz. So the Gemara is talking Bisman Hazeh, and he has the Shnei Tavshilin, and one of the Shnei Tavshilin is a Zecher to the Korban Pesach. That's what we call the Zroa. And he should not lift it up. So he lifts up the matzah, he lifts up the maror. But the Rambam is talking even Bisman Beis Hamikdash, and nevertheless he says you don't lift up the Pesach. So the Rambam says, "Umachzir shulchan lefanav v'yomer Pesach zeh sha'anu ochlim," and he says he recites Rabban Gamliel. Shemaschal avodim hayinu machzir hakara sheba matzos lefanav v'korei kol hagod sheish din lomar es hagoda al hamatzah. And again, this is a reflection of the Gemara of Shmuel that we learned. Lechem oni sha'onim olav dvarim harbe. And he should say matzah zu and mar zeh. And he says it might be a din in Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim shetzarch le'omer ala matzah. This is even going beyond Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel says that at some point he should point to the matzah and say matzah zu and explain why we eat the matzah, but it could be that the matzah is related to the entire sipur, and therefore the entire sipur should be recited over the matzah. Shedarshu bavur zeh lo amarti el b'shosha matzah umar munachim lefanecha. Then he says, possibly zeu din b'matzah b'shem lechem oni shikayim oleha mitzvahs aniyah v'sipur. So now he's saying this is a din in matzah, that the matzah has to be lechem oni, which means you have to recite that God over the matzah for the sake of the matzah to generate the shem lechem oni on the matzah. So he says that the Iker Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim should be recited over the matzah. Shebechol ha'agoda is on the top left column. Tiyeh ha'matzah al shulchan. So again, he's saying that the matzah not only, requires that we explain the Tama matzah, but the matzah should be there for the entire Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim. Mi'avodim hayinu ad sof hasipur. So again, it's not necessarily so that the matzah has to be there for the entire sipur. I mean, lechem oni she'onim olav dvarim harbe means that for part of the sipur, he's got the matzah there on the table. He says the ikar adin zeu shechelik hasipur hashayach lematzah yomer al hamatzah. Right, so this is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is saying that part of the Sipur Yitzis Mitzrayim, again we're going according to the Rash Beitz, has to be recited over the matzah, but it doesn't mean that the entire ganze tzipur from beginning to end has, from avodim hayinu till the end of Sipur Tzitzarim, has to be with the matzah munach al shulchan. He says the following: we have three different drushos. We have bavur zeh lo amarti ela b'shosha matzu mar munachim lefanecha. We have lechem oni sha'onim olav torim harbe. I'm sorry, we had two drushos. I said three, I meant two. He says the following: bavur zeh is a din. Again, we're going to the Rashbei's Sipur Mitzrayim. Shedino lehe omer b'shas b'shas shematzu mar munachim lefanecha. And that might be b'shah meaning at the time that you have a mitzvah of achilas matzah, achilas mar. Because the Rambam writes, "Uminayin shebelel chamisha sor, hamalov yigadet v'bincha bayoma ulema bavur zeh b'shah sheish matzu mar munachim lefanecha." So as far as bavur zeh, it would seem that Sipur Tzitzarim has to be bizman achilas matzah. Of blechem oni, on the other hand, yalfina din shamatzah ba'matzah shei omer aleh sipur koldu. That one part of the sipur should be over the matzah, and that makes the matzah into lechem oni. Okay, let's for a moment fast forward here to maskel bignus u'misayim b'shvach. So this was the Mishnah on Kuf Tezayin Omid Aleph, and the Gemara brings Rav Shita about Avodah Zarah and Shmuel Shita about Avodim Hayinu. Tzarech Ian l'Shmuel Mao Aloshen Ginus v'Shvach Havi Leila Meimer Maskil B'Tzara U'Mesayim B'Geula. What is Shmuel's take on Gnus and Shvach? I think Rav Soloveitchik is assuming that it's not so obvious that Avodim Hayinu L'Far Mitzrayim is Gnus. And our obligation is to appreciate the Geula, and therefore we want to be maskil b'tzara. We'll talk about the difficulties. Now the Mishnah says, "U'Mesayim b'shvach v'doresh me'arami oved oviat sheyigmar kol parsha kula." He says, l'chora, you should read it separately. Like there's a period in between Masechet Pesachim, period, and then Doresh Me'arami Oved Ovi. That's a separate independent requirement. So the mitzvah Sipur Tzitzarim requires to be Doresh the parsha of Arami Oved Ovi. That has nothing to do with Maskel Bignus U'Misayim B'Shvach. But let's look at the Rambam's language in Perek Zayin. The Rambam writes, "V'tzorech lahaskel Bignus U'Misayim B'Shvach Keitzad." And the Rambam writes, "Maskel Mesaper Shebitchila Hayu Avoseinu U'Misayim B'Shvach B'Nisim V'Niflos Shenasu Lanu U'Bichiruseinu V'Hu Sheyidrosh Me'arami Ovid Ovi Ad Sheyigmar Kol Parsha." So language for who indicates that somehow the drasha of Arami Ovid Ovi is connected to Maskel B'Gnus U'Misayim B'Shvach. Why is that so? Ve'anire Tehina Yain B'Gemara Soto Lamed Beis Amid Beis Tanya Rab Shimon Bar Yochai Omer Adam Shvacha B'Kol Namuch Ugnuso B'Kol Ram. Gnuso B'Kol Ram Mi Mikra Bikurim. So Rashi says, what's Gnuso? Kigon Arami Ovid Avi. Hainu Gnuso. Shemisvadim Shaviem Lovan Arami Hoya Rosha. So when a person brings Bikurim, part of the Bikurim is Gnus, and that's called Arami Ovid Avi, referring to Lavan Arami, who is our grandfather through Leah. And Rashi calls that Vidu. It's like a confession of sin. Again, you might ask me, why do I have to confess for Lavan's sins? Maybe the word Vidu here should not be translated as confession, but rather as admission or recognition. Mavurmi said, the whole Pashas Rabbi Ovi, Chilasa Bignus. Right? When Rab Shimba Yochai says, Omer Adam Shvacha B'Kol Namuch Ugnuso B'Kol Ram, and Rashi says, Gnuso B'Kol Ram is referring to Mikra Bikurim, Arami Ovid Avi, which Rashi explains is Gnuso because you're admitting that Lavan, our forefather, was a Rasha. So the beginning of Parshas Arami Ovid Avi is a Gnus, which should be recited B'Kol Ram. The Imkein Nirida Rama Mefarish Siyum Mishnah V'Doresh Arami Avi Ovid Avi at Sof Kol Parsha the Kol Zeu Midin Masel B'Gnus U'Mesai B'Shvach. So Gam Ikar Din de Gnus U'Shvach Nilma Mehach Parsha D'Arami Ovid Avi. B'Kshem Shehi Mascheles B'Gnus U'Mesayemes B'Shvach. Didn't say the Masel B'Gnus was Kaim V'Leil say the V'Tarte B'Guf HaSibri Tzis Shai Shemaskal Avodim Ayilu V'Od Shumis Kaim B'Guf Trash Parshas Arami Ovid Avi Shetchilosa B'Gnus V'Siyuma B'Shvach V'Gam Zeh Chelik Misibri Tzis Mitzrayim V'Gam Ba Noeg Hadin D'Gnus U'Shvach U'Miyushav Loshen D'Gnus U'Shvach Gam Aliba D'Shmuel Dozeu Mekar Hadin Via Ukir Alfinan Lo Mimikra Bikur. Okay, so that's Rav Soloveitchik's introduction to the machlokus between Rav and Shmuel, and Holy Nether we'll try to get more into that in the future. Weiter in the Mishnah Pesach al Shum shePasach haMokom al Bote Avoseidu b'Mitzrayim. That at the time of Makas Bechoros, HaKadosh Baruch Hu skipped over the houses of our forefathers, and he wasn't Nogev the Bechorei Yisrael. Shenemar. With regard to Sibri Tzis Mitzrayim, it says, "V'amartem Zevach Pesach Hu Lashem Asher Posach." Omar, he says in the number Dalit, HaKorban Kori Pesach al Shem HaPsicha V'Adiluk, that God skipped over. That's why it's called Pesach. Ubira Pasach al Pi Divrei Ragam Liel V'Amartem Livnechem Zevach Zehu Lashem HaKori Pesach Hareu Zecher L'Nes Shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Batei Yisrael. And mitevas ve'amartem shebepasuk zeh lamadnu shemitzvah lomar bepeh es tam mitzvahs korban pesach v'chein es tam shel matzah umar shehukshu lepesach. So it's all zecher l'nes shepasach Kadosh Baruch Hu al Batei Yisrael. Matzal shum shenigalu avosenu Mitzrayim shenemar vayofu es habatzeik asher otziu miMitzrayim ugos matzos kilo chametz ki gorshu miMitzrayim v'lo yochlu l'smameh. Let's see if he adds anything here. He says, Inyan zeh, no behei, shalo hispik b'tzeikom lahachmitz. So let's see in the Mishnah, it says, Matz al shum ma, al shum shenigalu avosenu Mitzrayim. And it says, Vayofu es habatzeik asher otziu miMitzrayim. I'm just going to change my position here a little bit, if it's okay with you. The Rambam also just simply copies the Mishnah, Matzal Shem Shen Nigalu. But in our Haggados, the nusach is Matzah Zu al Shum Shalo Hispik B'Tzeikom Shal Avosenu Lahachmitz Ad Shenigla Leah Melech Malchei Amlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Golo V'cheinu B'nusach Haggadah Sheberambam. So there's Perek Zayin and Perek Ches. So Perek Zayin, the Rambam says just Matzal Shem Shenigalu, which is the Girsa in our Mishnah. But in Perek Ches, he presents the Nusach as we have it in our Haggados, Al Shem Shlo Hispik B'Tzeikom Shel Avosenu Lahachmitz, etc., etc. Now he quotes the Maram Chalava and the Ram. Masha ochlu matzah baderech hoyezeh al yidei shemiher HaKadosh Baruch Hu legolam. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to redeem them quickly. So we're remembering the geula by eating matzah. But he quotes another commentary, Shanusach shebe Mishnah hu anemar bizman beis hamigdash Shematzah necheles ima Pesach. He chelik mi'akrovas korban Pesach. Interesting. That our Mishnah is not interested at all in the historical reality of matzah, which means that they didn't have time to allow that bread to leaven, but rather it's connected to the Korban Pesach. And at the time that they ate the Korban Pesach, they ate matzah with the Korban Pesach, because the pasuk says al matzah sumrom yochlu. So it's all part of the Pesach. I'm not sure what he means here. On the bottom right, he says uchelik me'akrovas Korban Pesach. I mean, I would have changed the text to chelik me'achilas Korban Pesach. Not sure. Where do we find that we take bread and it accompanies a korban? In lachmei toda, 40 lachamim. V'alkein, anu omrim shenitztavenu ba al simchas hageula ke'ein lachmei toda. In other words, the korban of lachmei toda, as an expression of our joy, should be accompanied by lachmei toda, by the lachamim. And here too, when we bring the Korban Pesach, and we're expressing our simcha on the geula, we accompany the Korban Pesach with matzah. Now, the nusach that we have, which doesn't connect matzah and its reason to the Korban Pesach, that was written bisman hazeh. Our Nusach Haggadah reflects post-Churban, and therefore we cannot say, well, the matzah is there to accompany the Korban Pesach. But rather, Tam Achilas Matzah is Zecher Sheyotzu Avoseinu Mimitzrayim B'chipazon. All right, number 3, back to the Mishnah. Morar al shum shemeru hamitzrayim eschay avoseinu b'mitzrayim. Shenemar vayamaru eschayim. Now it's interesting that in each case we mention the pasuk. If I understand this correctly, shenemar. Now I'm wondering if he left out the pasuk, would he be yotze? Let me just see if he adds anything here. Number ches. Es kol avodasam. It says es kol avodasim means im kol avodasim. All right. Now, what does he have here in the name of the Maram Chalava? V'lo yachlu lihismameh. Right, we were thrown out. We were expelled from Mitzrayim, and we didn't have time to tarry. Nireh She'ilu sha'oyo lahem pnai lahachmitz es b'tzegam hayu machmitzin also. So if the Jewish people, when they were redeemed from Mitzrayim, they left Mitzrayim, had they had the time, they would have baked chametz. Why? They should have Pesach Mitzrayim lo nesru b'chametz. They didn't. The Isur Achilas chametz didn't yet emerge. Uksha'afu lemachar hayimutar lachmitza. Okay, fine. So at that point in time, there was no Isur chametz, and they could have been machmitz Isur, but lo yacholos mamea ki garshu mitzrayim. Ulam haRamban kosav shevnei shenitztavu b'Mitzrayim sior lo yimatzei bebatechem v'yaosalem lahachmitz es b'tzeikom. So Ramban is arguing that although there was no Isur Achilas chametz at that point in time when they left Mitzrayim, but there was Isur of owning or possessing chametz. So therefore, they could not allow their batek to rise because then they would violate the Isur of Sior lo yimatzei b'batechem. So what's this ki garshu mitzrayim according to the Ramban? The way we understand it, that there was no Isur chametz, so the pasuk is justified by saying that they baked matzah ki garshu mitzrayim, v'lo yachlu l'smameh. But according to the Ramban, regardless of whether or not ki garshu mitzrayim, forget about garshu mitzrayim, they couldn't bake chametz because then they would violate the Isur of kol sior lo yimatzei b'batechem. Vayofu es habotzek asher hotziu miMitzrayim ugos matzos ki lo chametz. So what does that mean? Ki lo chametz. Mipnei isur chametz. So they couldn't bake chametz because of the Isur chametz. Vatam shelo afu abotzek be'ir ela b'derech. Not sure what he's asking now. Vatam shelo afu abotzek be'ir ela b'derech. He's trying to explain what's ki garshu miMitzrayim v'lo yachlu l'smameh. Well, what is that coming to explain? They couldn't bake matzahs because chametz because by definition there was an Isur chametz. So what's this whole business in the pasuk about ki garshu miMitzrayim? That the reason why they baked matzahs is because they didn't have time to bake bread. He says, "Umiaru terem hichmitz the afu oso badora." Shafu besukos shigiu l'sham v'esak. 1 second. So what's he saying? you figure this out? I don't know what he means here. The Ramban is of the opinion that they didn't even have an option of baking chametz because of the Easter of Sior Lo Yimotze B'Teichem. So what does it mean, asks the Ramban, Vayofu es habatzeik, and it says, Ki garshu b'Mitzrayim v'lo yochlu smamea. Well, what's Ki garshu b'Mitzrayim? He says that this is explaining why they didn't bake the batzeik in the city, but rather in the derech. I think he's saying the following. The Torah is answering the following question. They were leaving Mitzrayim. They needed food for sustenance, and they couldn't bake it when they were on the way because they had to move very fast. Well, why couldn't they bake it in the city before they left? Again, they would have baked matzah, not chametz, because the according to Ramban, they were enjoined from owning chametz. But why?
Did they have a Masorah from Avraham not to have chametz?
Yeah, that what?
Did they have a Masorah from Avraham not to have chametz on the 15th of Nisan?
That they did have chametz?
That they didn't.
That they didn't
because he had baked matzahs when the angels came, and we kind of thought that was the time of Pesach. So did they have a Masorah that the 15th of Nisan they weren't supposed to have chametz?
That could be. I'd have to know more to answer your question. But one thing is clear. The Ramban is of the opinion that when it says Kol Sior Lo Yimotze B'Vatechem, that you're not allowed to possess chametz, that applied even when they left Mitzrayim. So they didn't have an option, al pi din, to bake matzah, to bake chametz. So what's this whole thing about? The Torah says Ki gershu and Lo Yochlu Smamea. They were in a rush. Forget about that. That doesn't seem to be an explanation that's necessary. It's totally superfluous because they didn't even have an option halachically to bake matzah. So the Ramban is saying, if I understand correctly, that the Torah is not answering the question, why didn't they bake chametz, but rather, why didn't they bake it before they left Mitzrayim? And rather, they baked it on the road. And the Torah is saying that they had to leave Mitzrayim in a rush, in a jiff, and therefore they didn't have time to bake matzahs. That's what he's learning. I don't know exactly why this is so. Why did the Torah feel it's very important that we know that they couldn't bake matzahs in the city before they left? Obviously, that's a reality and that's a history, and the Torah is recording the history of our forefathers in terms of what they were able to bake and what they couldn't bake and where and when. But I'm wondering if there's some deeper significance here to what's being said. So let's just finish up now with the next line in the Mishnah. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam liros esatzmo kilu hu yotzav Mitzrayim shenemar v'yigadet lebincha bayom u'leimor b'avur zeh Asa Hashem li b'tzeisi miMitzrayim. All right, that's where we're going to stop for today. So let me take this opportunity to wish you a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut, and I think we'll resume on Sunday, Amir Tzashem. Okay then? All right, great. Have a happy.